So let's look now at how to move the player left and right when they start using the keys on the keyboard. Now it's up to you what keys you allow them to use. I'm going to use the arrow keys on the keyboard, but you could use the A, S, D and W keys if you want to. That's totally up to you, but keep it sensible so that most people will be able to get a hang of the game quite quickly. So for this one, I'm actually going to move my player over here simply because I need to show them moving left and right. And over here, there isn't really very much room for them to move left and right. So I'm going to start them off over here for the moment instead. So there we are, just position them slightly above the ground, and where they've got plenty of room to move left and right, you can do the same with yours. And to do the code, we need to make sure that it is the player sprite that we're selecting. We don't want to add code yet for the platform. So click on the player sprite, and then at the top left of your screen, click on code. And this will take you to the code window. Now, if you've used Scratch before, this will be familiar to you. It has changed a little bit in the last few months. But if you're not used to Scratch, then the main thing to be aware of is that you've got these different blocks of code that you can drag out from the left-hand side. If you don't want them, you can just drag them and drop them anywhere on that left-hand side again. And you have these blocks in different categories. So the blue blocks are all to do with motion, moving things around. The purple is looks, so that's about changing costumes, changing appearance, changing size. We've got sound, so we can play sound effects like the duck you heard earlier. Events are quite important. This tells us when to start certain blocks of code. Control is also really useful, including loops, telling us to do something over and over and over again, and asking questions. Should we do this? Should we do that? Is it time to do this? We've got sensing, which will be really important for detecting whether one sprite is touching another. Operations are all the little fiddly bits, such as the plus, minus, multiply, divide, pick a random number. Is this bigger than that? Is that bigger than the other? So that's all those. And variables, which we don't need that one in there. Let me just delete my variable for the moment. Variables are basically labels on, you can think of them as little boxes, a little box that can contain a single bit of information, such as what level are we on? How many lives have we got? And that information can be put in this little box, and we label it with a name just so we know what's in that box. And if we want to tell the computer, oh, go and check what level we're on, it'll look in that box called level and find that number and let us know what it is, and now we can do something with it. And then we've got my blocks at the bottom, but we won't be using that in this series of tutorials, so don't worry too much about that. So let's get started then. The first thing we need to do is to grab the green flag block from events. This is the really important one. I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can see this code a bit more clearly. You can zoom in your code using the using the plus and minus magnifying glasses there. The double line at the bottom just simply resets it back so that you can see all of your code. But let me just zoom in a bit so you can see this more clearly. So the green flag simply is this green flag up here. So when the player clicks that green flag, the game begins. What do we want to happen when the game begins? Well, the first thing is we want to make sure the player is sent to this start position. We might already be playing a game and the player might be way off in the corner over here. So if we want a new game, we've got to set the player back to this position here. And there's a really useful block that we can use for that in motion. You'll see at the moment there's a go to block here, and the coordinates say -70 for the X and -137 for the Y. If I move the player, you'll see that these numbers have now changed. So these X and Y coordinates update whenever we move the player around. So there again, they're different. So I want to move the player to the position I want them to be in at the start of the game, which is there. These coordinates now update to show the exact position the player is in right now. That's my start position, so I'll grab that block and drop it right underneath the green flag. And you see how these blocks connect together. They sort of snap together like that, and that's exactly what you want. Now we need to have a variable now. And this variable is going to keep track of how fast we're moving. we're going to add a little bit of acceleration to this. So when we start moving, we kind of go at a certain speed, but when we let go of the arrow keys or whatever controls you're going to use, rather than just stopping dead, we're going to kind of slow down gradually, so sort of skidding to a halt, if you like. And that makes it just feel a little bit more realistic. So we also have to then plan when to jump and when to land and how much space we're going to need in order to land. So it makes the game a bit more interesting. So let's go over to the variables category here and click make a variable. And we're going to call this one speed X because it is the speed we're moving along the X category. So click OK, and you'll see we now have these other orange blocks in the variables section. So we're going to set, at the moment, set speed X to 0. So when we start a new game, the speed we're moving along the X-axis is 0. It's nothing. We're not moving. So that's important that we're not moving at the beginning of the game. Now we need to do something forever, which does seem like a long time. We need to, as long as the game is playing, we need to constantly check to see if the player is pressing the left key or the right key, and if we're touching the platform or not. We need to constantly check that. So to constantly do something, we need to head back into the events section, sorry, the controls section, beg pardon, the controls section, and grab one of these forever blocks and just snap that underneath. So now while the game is running, everything inside this block will happen over and over and over again until the game ends. So what do we want to do? Well, we need to check whether the player is pressing the right arrow key, whatever key you're going to choose. Excuse me. So we need to know whether or not they're playing it. So we need the computer to ask a question. And the computer can ask itself a question using this kind of block here, if. If this is the case, then do something. In this particular case, if the player is pressing the right arrow key, then go right. That's what we want. So grab this if-then block and put it inside the forever block. Now we need to know whether the player is pressing the right arrow key. So that's something that we are sensing. So we go to sensing, and we can see we've got key space pressed just here. But we can change that to any key at all, and in this case it's going to be the right arrow key. So this now goes inside this little cartouche section here. It can be a bit tricky at first if you're not used to it, getting it lined up. But what you're looking for is that kind of glow around the cartouche. You see that little white glow around the edge? If I see that, I can let go, and that drops right in there like that. So we have this question now. If the right arrow key is pressed, then what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is to change the speed that we're going to be moving. So let's head over to variables, and we're going to change the speed. Now we're changing it, not setting it, because of course we don't know whether we're already moving or not. We may be already moving, we may be slowing down, having just stopped moving. So we're going to just change speed X by 1. So that increases it just by 1. That's it. So now we need to tell whether the left arrow key is pressed. Now we have this whole if block here for the right arrow key. We can actually duplicate that block. If I right click somewhere on that if section there and choose duplicate, which means copy, I get an exact copy of that whole section. And here I want to know if the left arrow key is pressed. Let's just drag this up underneath the other if block. Make sure you don't go inside the other if block. We want these two if blocks to be one after the other. So you see I have, if I just move those out, one if block there, one if block underneath it, and both of those inside forever. So if the right arrow key is pressed, we change speed X by 1. What do you think we need to change speed X by if we go left? Well, if you think of X as being on a graph and this game like one great big graph, The x-axis along the bottom will increase by 1 as you go to the right, and of course it will decrease by 1 as you go to the left. So in this case, if the left arrow is pressed, we need to change speed x by -1. So put a -1 in there. And then we can simply say, let's now change the x position of our player on this graph, if you like, by whatever this speed is now. So we know what the speed is. Okay, let's move the player by that much speed. So for this, we go to motion, which means movement, and we're going to change the x of the player. So we're changing the x position. Pop that there. What are we changing it by? Well, not a number, it's by that variable speed x. So let's grab the variable speed x from the variable section. There it is at the top there. I can drag that and drop it into that oval section there. So we're now changing x by speed x. Now, one thing you may notice if you're really observant is that this variable speed x is being displayed in our game. There it is. We can move it around. And that is something that is totally useless for the player. They don't need to know that. So how can we still use the variable but not have it displayed in the game? Well, on the left-hand side in the variable section, you can see that speed x has a blue tick next to it, or more accurately, a white tick in a blue box. If I click that tick, I can still use that variable. It's still in my code, but you see it's no longer displayed in the game, which just keeps things a little bit neater. So now if we try running the game, I'll click the green flag, and I press the right arrow key and the left arrow key, you can see that I can move my player left and right. You will probably have some problems, and I will strongly recommend that you only tap the keys left and right and you don't press and hold them down. If you do, you might find yourself apparently stuck to the side of the wall simply because you're moving at a ferocious speed in that direction. So if you do get stuck against the wall, simply click the red circle at the top to stop the game and then restart it. But you can see I'm able to move left and right, that's fine, but there is a problem. We're going through the platform and we obviously don't want that. So let's stop the game. Let's click the red circle at the top to stop the game. And we need to add a little bit more code now underneath this section here that will tell whether we're touching the platform. Now we have the platform sprite over here, and of course it's called platform. So that makes it really easy for us to tell whether this player sprite is touching that platform sprite. So how do we do that? Well, once again, we need to ask a question. Are we touching the platform sprite? Now, in this situation, we don't actually want this if block. And the reason is that an if block can only do one thing. It can ask the question, and if that question is true, if the answer is yes to that question, then it does whatever's inside it. But this question, if we're touching the platform, are we touching the platform, has two possible answers. Either yes, we are, or no, we're not. And in either case, we need to do something. If we are touching the platform, we need to stop. We need to stop moving. We need to reset the speed back down to 0. We need to stop the player from going through the platform. But if we are not touching the platform, we need to be able to start to slow the player down if they're not pressing left or right. So it's a dead stop if we're touching the platform, and a slowing down if we are not touching the platform, but we're not pressing left or right either. So how do we do that? Well, this if block only has one option, and we need an if block that has two options. So if we're touching the platform, then do this, else or otherwise, or in other case, do this action. So this is two possible options here, depending on the answer up here. So let's put this block just underneath the change x by speed x. It still needs to be inside this big forever loop, which you see is holding almost all of our code. So if what? Well, we need to know if we're touching the platform. So let's go to sensing, and touching something is at the top here. It currently says touching mouse pointer. So we can change that to platform. That's simply the name of the sprite that we named over here, and pop that in the cartouche at the top. So if we're touching the platform, what do we do? Well, we have to make sure that whatever speed we're going at right now, we stop that. So we are basically going to have to take the speed. Let's say the speed is 7 at the moment. So we are going to have to take 7 away from our speed. If our speed is 10, we'd have to take 10 away from that speed. So how can we do that? Well, the simplest way of doing that is if we go into motion and we get our change x by, and just drop that in this top box here, change x by. What we can do is grab our multiplication block, which has a little star, the asterisk here. We don't have the x because that would be confusing. It might be the x for the position. So we have a little asterisk there for multiply. So if we put that in the circle, change x by, we can have the speed x variable on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we can have a -1. What that will do is take whatever speed x is right now, and by multiplying that number by -1, it'll bring it back down to 0. In other words, it'll stop it dead. So then what we can do is set speed x to 0, so we're no longer going to be moving anywhere. So if we're touching the platform, this brings the it brings the position of it down to nothing, so effectively stop moving, and set the speed to 0 so that we are stuck at that position. But what happens if we're not touching the platform? What do we do then? So in this situation, we're not touching the left or right arrow keys, because if we were, then we'd be doing this code up here. So if we're not touching the left and right arrow keys and we're not touching the platform, what do we do? Well, we're simply going to slow down gradually, and we can do that by setting the speed x to, and we need another multiplier in here. Let's grab that one there. And it's going to be whatever speed x is now multiplied by, and you can change this number, but I'm going to go for 0.8. And what that basically does is by taking this and multiplying it by 0.8, we're effectively making speed x 80% of what it was before. And as this is in a forever loop, speed x is going to be whatever speed x is now and just 80% of it. Then the next time the loop goes around, it'll be 80% of that, then 80% of that, and then 80% of that. And so it will incrementally, it'll gradually reduce the speed down bit by bit by bit in a gradual process. And that will give us that sort of slowing down gradually. You can play around with this number. If you increase the number, you might find that you're sliding around as though you were on an icy world. If you were to decrease that, then you'd end up being much sort of more solid, so you'll be sticking to the ground. I think it's that way around. Could be the other way around actually, but yeah, play with the numbers, see what happens. This is really about experimentation as well, so play around with the numbers and see what happens. Let me run this game now, and I'm going to do this in full screen mode just so we can see this more clearly. So I'm going to click the green flag. Obviously we're not falling and we can't jump at the moment, but if I move left and right, so there it is, it's moving left and right, and if I head towards the wall, you can see I can no longer go through the platform. And also, if I let go, now you're not going to be able to really tell this, so you'll have to play the game to experience this. But if I let go, I can see that it doesn't stop exactly. You may just be able to see that when I let go, letting go now, it just sort of skids to a halt a little bit. It just carries on for a little bit and skids to a halt. It slows down gradually. If I change this number, let's just change that number down to, let's try 0.4, shall we? See what that happens. Let's see what that does. So let's go full screen, let's run it, slide to the right, and it stops pretty dead. So it's pretty solid now. I'm not really sliding around much at all. So let's increase that number now to 0.95. Oops. So again, let's go to full screen. and run it, and now it really skids on ages. So let's start from here. So I'm pressing it, let go, and it slides ages before coming to a halt. Now that of course could make for a really interesting game. That could make for a very challenging game if you've got tiny platforms, you've got to jump on the platform and you slide on the platform because it's made of ice. That can be really difficult. 0.8 is what I'm sticking with. That's fine for me, but you can play around with that as much as you like. But there we are, that's it. We've done all the code we need to allow the player to move left and right. So once you've done that code and experimented with the numbers and you've tested the game, of course, make sure that you do. Don't forget to click Save Now or click File, Save Now to make sure that you've saved your progress. Test the game out, and when you're ready, we'll start to look at the code that we need in order to allow the player to jump and, of course, fall.